The cast-iron skillet slipped from Thomas Carter's hand and crashed across the kitchen floor just as 7-year-old Jacob cried out from the barnyard. Thomas lunged for the door, only to find the boy sprawled in the frozen mud with blood running from a scraped knee, while 11-year-old Emma struggled to pull a frightened calf away from him. The little family looked more exhausted than scared. That was the hardest part. Thomas scooped Jacob into his arms without a word. Emma brushed dirt from her worn dress before anyone could help her, just as she always did. At 11 years old, she already carried herself like someone twice her age because grief had stolen the childhood she should have been living. For years had passed since Mary Carter was buried beneath the old cottonwood overlooking the ranch, yet every morning still felt like the first day without her. Breakfast burned. Shirts were mended badly. The house stayed clean only because Emma quietly did work no little girl should ever have needed to learn. If you've ever watched a child try to become the parent they lost, then you know the kind of silence that filled that ranch. Thomas washed Jacob's wound with warm water from the stove, tied a rough bandage around the boy's knee, and rested a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. She offered him a brave little smile before turning away to finish the chores her mother once handled. That smile hurt him more than any lonely night ever could. The wagon had to go into town that afternoon. Flour was nearly gone. Lamp oil sat at the bottom of its tin, and the chickens would not wait for sorrow to pass before laying eggs. So Thomas hitched the horses, lifted Jacob onto the seat, and helped Emma climb beside him. None of them noticed how quiet the road had become until the church bell echoed across the prairie. The town looked no richer than the ranches surrounding it. Men gathered outside the mercantile speaking in low voices about failed harvests and families moving farther west. Near the church steps, a young woman stood with a worn leather satchel pressed tightly against her chest. Her dress was neat despite weeks of travel, but the tired look in her eyes told a story no stranger could easily hide. Thomas barely noticed her at first. Then Jacob jumped from the wagon before it fully stopped. His boot caught the edge of a crate. He struck the ground hard. The sharp cry turned every head on the street. Before Thomas could reach him, the young woman was already kneeling beside the frightened boy. She tore a clean strip from an old handkerchief, carefully wrapped Jacob's bleeding hand, and smiled with the calm patience of someone who had comforted frightened children many times before. "It's all right," she whispered softly. "You're much braver than this scrape." Jacob sniffled once, then smiled back. Thomas stopped only a few steps away. For reasons he could not explain, the sight of a stranger comforting his son stirred something inside him that had been buried almost as deeply as his wife. He thanked the woman with a respectful nod. She answered with the same quiet kindness. Neither of them knew that before another sunset, a single whispered confession inside the boarding house would change every lonely year that still lay ahead. And as Thomas guided his children toward the mercantile, Martha Wilson was already watching all four of them from across the dusty street, wearing the knowing smile of someone who believed that sometimes Providence arrived looking exactly like a stranger. Thomas Carter had always believed a quiet goodbye was safer than lingering conversation. After thanking the young woman for helping Jacob, he finished the family's errands and started the wagon toward the ranch before dusk settled over the Montana prairie. Yet all the way home, Jacob kept asking the same question. "Do you think we'll ever see Miss again?" Thomas only flicked the reins gently. "Maybe." Emma stared out across the grasslands without speaking. She had noticed something her father had not. The stranger's smile had reached Jacob before it reached anyone else. Children had a way of trusting hearts long before adults did. The Carter Ranch greeted them with the same silence that had waited every evening for 4 long years. Thomas carried sacks of flour inside, while Emma lit the oil lamps. Jacob wandered into the kitchen, sniffed the stew simmering on the stove, and frowned. "It still doesn't taste like Mama's." The words were innocent. The silence afterward was not. Thomas looked toward the old rocking chair beside the fireplace. No one had sat there since Mary died. He swallowed the ache that never truly left and quietly stirred the pot, pretending not to notice Emma lowering her eyes. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, Thomas stepped onto the porch with a tin cup of coffee. Sheriff Daniel Brooks rode through the gate just before moonrise. "You've been hiding out long enough," Daniel teased as he climbed down from his horse. "Folks are starting to think the ranch swallowed you whole." Thomas managed a faint smile. "The ranch keeps me busy." "No," Daniel answered gently. "Your memories do." Thomas said nothing. Daniel had buried Mary's coffin beside him 4 years earlier. He knew there were some wounds a friend could not heal with conversation. You can't raise 2 children and a ranch forever by yourself. "I've managed." "You survived," Daniel corrected. "That ain't the same thing." Thomas looked toward the upstairs window where Emma's lamp had finally gone dark. "I promised Mary I'd take care of them. And you kept that promise." Daniel paused before adding quietly, "But maybe taking care of them means letting someone help." The words lingered long after hoofbeats faded into the night. Across town, Clara Bennett sat alone on the stone steps outside the small church. Her travel satchel rested beside her, holding nearly everything she owned: 2 dresses, several worn books, a small Bible, and the teaching certificate she had not been able to use for almost a year. The pastor had offered her bread. Martha Wilson had offered her a warm bed upstairs at the boarding house. But neither could offer what she truly missed: belonging. The church doors creaked open behind her. Martha stepped outside, carrying a wool blanket. "You'll catch your death sitting out here." Clara accepted the blanket with grateful hands. "I'm sorry for troubling everyone." "You haven't troubled anybody. I've been looking for work for months." Martha sat beside her. "The school already has a teacher. The mercantile isn't hiring. Most ranches barely have enough money to pay their own hands." Clara smiled politely. "I'll keep looking." Martha studied her face for several quiet moments. "Do you have anyone waiting for you somewhere?" For the first time that evening, Clara's smile disappeared. She looked toward the dark prairie stretching beyond the churchyard. "My parents died during the fever." Martha listened without interrupting. "My brother," Clara whispered, "never came home from the army." The wind shifted softly through the cottonwoods. "There isn't anyone left." Her voice became almost too quiet to hear. "I have no family left." At that exact moment, Thomas stepped through the boarding house doorway after returning a borrowed ledger Martha had accidentally left at the mercantile. He stopped, not because he meant to overhear, because those 6 words reached a place inside him he believed had died with his wife. He looked toward Clara. She wasn't asking for pity. She wasn't crying. She simply sounded tired. The kind of tired loneliness creates after years of carrying itself alone. Thomas stood there for several seconds before speaking. "Funny." Both women turned. He shifted his hat awkwardly, suddenly feeling less confident than he had facing blizzards or stampeding cattle. "My children need a mother." Silence settled over the porch. Clara blinked, unsure whether she had heard correctly. Thomas quickly shook his head. "I don't mean, not like that." A faint flush reached his weathered face. "I own a ranch outside town." He searched carefully for the right words. "The house needs someone who knows how to make it feel like a home again." He glanced toward Clara with quiet honesty. "The children deserve better than what I've been giving them." Martha's eyes sparkled, though she wisely stayed silent. Thomas continued. "There be honest pay. A room of your own. As long as you wish to stay. No promises beyond that." Clara lowered her eyes. It was the first offer of steady work she had received in nearly a year. But somehow, it felt like something much larger than employment had just knocked gently upon the door of her lonely life. Neither of them knew whether accepting would heal old wounds or awaken the ones they had spent years trying to bury. The morning sun had barely climbed above the Montana hills when Clara Bennett stood on the porch of the Carter Ranch with a small leather satchel in one hand. Everything she owned rested inside it. She looked at the weathered farmhouse, the faded white fence, and the smoke curling from a chimney. It was not grand. It was not elegant. But for the first time in many months, someone had opened a door instead of turning her away. Thomas met her outside before she could knock. "You found the place." She smiled gently. "I wasn't sure I'd still be welcome. I gave my word." Those 4 quiet words were enough. Emma watched from the kitchen window, without waving. Jacob, however, burst through the front door before anyone could stop him. "Miss Clara!" He nearly collided with her, then suddenly remembered his manners and stepped back with an embarrassed grin. "Morning," he whispered. Clara laughed softly. "Good morning, Jacob." The sound lingered inside the old farmhouse long after they walked through the doorway. Thomas showed her the small bedroom at the end of the hallway. "It isn't much. It's more than I've had in a long while. The pay comes at the end of every month. And if someday you find a better opportunity..." Clara interrupted with a gentle shake of her head. "I don't know where tomorrow will take me." She looked around the little room before adding quietly, "But today, this is enough." Thomas nodded once. Neither of them noticed Emma standing outside the half-open door, listening in silence. The first few days passed with careful distance. Clara never tried to rearrange Mary's belongings. She did not remove the embroidered curtains. She did not touch the rocking chair beside the fireplace. Instead, she simply noticed what needed doing. She repaired torn kitchen towels. She scrubbed years of soot from the stove. She organized the pantry so flour, beans, and coffee no longer disappeared behind broken jars. She patched Jacob's favorite blanket without saying a word. Each act was small. Together, they slowly changed the rhythm of the house. Emma noticed. She simply refused to admit it. One afternoon, Clara found Emma struggling to carry 2 heavy buckets from the well. Without asking permission, Clara lifted one. "I can do it myself," Emma said quickly. "I know." Clara continued walking. "I'm only carrying one." Emma frowned. "I've always done Mother's chores." "I believe you. And I don't need help." Clara stopped before reaching the porch. "No." She looked at Emma with quiet understanding. "You need to be 11 years old." The girl looked away immediately. No one had said those words to her since her mother died. Still, she picked up her bucket again without answering. Jacob accepted Clara much faster. He followed her everywhere. Into the chicken coop. Across the vegetable garden. Even into the kitchen, where he insisted on stirring biscuit dough despite making an impressive mess. "You missed a bowl," Clara teased. Jacob looked down. "So I did." She handed him another spoon. "Then I suppose we'll have to make enough biscuits to feed the floor, too." His laughter echoed through the farmhouse. Thomas heard it from the barn. He froze with one hand resting on his saddle. He could not remember the last time laughter had sounded so free inside those walls. For several moments, he simply stood there listening. It felt almost unfamiliar. Yet somehow, it felt like home. Days turned into weeks. Fresh bread cooled beside the kitchen window. Wildflowers appeared in an old blue pitcher on the dining table. Jacob no longer rushed through supper. Emma slowly stopped eating with one eye fixed on the sink, waiting for the dishes she believed were her responsibility. Without announcing it, Clara simply washed them first. Thomas noticed every quiet kindness. He also noticed himself lingering in the doorway each morning just a little longer. Sometimes Clara hummed softly while kneading dough. Sometimes she read aloud from one of her old school books while Jacob colored pictures beside the stove. Even Emma occasionally forgot herself long enough to smile. Thomas found himself listening for Clara's voice before he entered the house each evening. That realization unsettled him more than any storm. One night, after the children had gone upstairs, Thomas remained at the kitchen table staring into an untouched cup of coffee. Clara folded a clean dish towel. "Is something wrong?" He hesitated. "I was trying to remember." "What?" "What this house sounded like before Mary died." He looked toward the staircase. "For a while I couldn't." His eyes returned to Clara. "But lately—" He smiled faintly. "I remembered." Neither of them spoke again. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. 2 days later, Thomas drove into town to deliver cattle contracts. Sheriff Daniel met him outside the livery stable. "You look different." Thomas frowned. "Ido." Daniel grinned. "You smiled before I even said good morning." Thomas tried to deny it. "I suppose I was thinking about getting home." Daniel folded his arms. "I reckon that's exactly what I meant." Thomas laughed quietly despite himself. It was the first genuine laugh Daniel had heard from his old friend in years. Back at the ranch, Clara stood on the porch watching the sunset with Emma beside her. After several long minutes, Emma finally spoke. "Jacob likes you." "I like Jacob, too." He laughs more now. "Ever noticed?" Emma looked across the pasture where Thomas was riding toward the house. "My mother used to sing while she cooked." Clara's expression softened. "I'm sure she had a beautiful voice." Emma nodded. "So do you—" For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. It was the closest Emma had come to opening the door around her heart. Neither of them knew that before long, someone from Clara's past would arrive to test every fragile piece of trust that had begun growing inside the Carter family. Late autumn arrived with sharp winds that carried the first promise of snow across the Montana prairie. By then, Clara no longer felt like a visitor at the Carter ranch. She knew exactly which floorboard creaked near the kitchen, how Thomas preferred his coffee before sunrise, and that Jacob always tried to sneak an extra biscuit before supper. Only Emma still kept one careful step between affection and acceptance. She smiled more often now. She spoke more freely. But every time Clara came close enough to feel like family, the little girl quietly retreated, as though loving someone again might somehow betray the mother she still missed. One chilly afternoon, Thomas and Clara drove into town together to collect supplies before winter. The streets were busy with ranchers preparing for the coming snow. As Clara stepped out of the mercantile, carrying a sack of flour, a polished black carriage stopped beside the boardwalk. A tall man in an expensive wool coat climbed down. His smile looked friendly. His eyes did not. Well, he removed his gloves slowly. "If it isn't Clara Bennett." Clara's face lost its color. Thomas noticed immediately. "You know him?" Before she could answer, the stranger tipped his hat. "Edwin Langley." "We were acquainted." Edwin laughed softly. That's a modest way of putting it. He looked Clara up and down before turning toward Thomas. "I once asked this lovely lady to marry me." His smile widened. Seems life had different plans. Thomas remained silent. Edwin continued. "I hear you're working as a house servant now. What a shame. You always dreamed of teaching children. And now you're scrubbing floors." Several people nearby stopped talking. Clara lowered her eyes. "I have honest work." "Of course you do." Edwin stepped closer. "But surely this isn't where you imagine your life ending." Thomas finally moved. He placed himself quietly between Edwin and Clara. "That's close enough." Edwin raised an eyebrow. "And you are—" Thomas Carter. "The man she works for?" Thomas's voice stayed calm. No, the man she's under protection of. The street fell silent. Edwin chuckled. I wasn't aware Miss Bennet needed protecting. Thomas never raised his voice. She doesn't, but she'll have it anyway. Edwin's pleasant smile disappeared. He leaned forward just enough for only Thomas to hear. People like her don't belong in respectable homes. Thomas looked him directly in the eye. Then I reckon you've never understood what makes a home respectable. Without another word, Thomas picked up the flour sack from Clara's hands and offered her his arm. We're leaving. Clara hesitated only a moment before walking beside him. No one on the boardwalk missed the quiet dignity of that simple gesture, nor the humiliation on Edwin Langley's face as they disappeared down the street together. The gossip reached the ranch before sunset. By the following afternoon, Emma overheard two women whispering outside the church. They say Thomas has forgotten his wife. Men always do. And that schoolteacher? Perhaps she planned it all along. Emma stood frozen behind the fence. Every careless word settled heavily inside a heart that was already confused. That evening she barely spoke during supper. After everyone had gone to bed, she quietly walked downstairs. The lamp in the parlor still burned. Clara was mending one of Jacob's shirts. You can stop pretending. Emma's voice startled her. Clara looked up gently. Pretending? You want to replace my mother. The needle stopped moving. I could never replace her. You already have. You cook. You clean. You laugh with Jacob. You sit where she used to sit. Tears filled Emma's eyes despite every effort to stop them. If Papa marries you, everyone will forget her. The words broke something inside the room. Clara slowly laid the shirt aside. She walked toward Emma, but stopped several feet away. I lost my own mother. Emma looked up. I still miss her every day. My loving your mother doesn't take anything away from mine. She swallowed carefully. And loving you would never erase her. Emma turned away before Clara could see the tears running down her face. I don't believe you. She ran upstairs. Clara remained standing alone in the quiet house. Thomas had heard every word from the hallway. He wanted to comfort Clara. Instead, he realized some wounds could only heal when the frightened heart was ready. 2 days later, while searching for extra blankets in the attic, Emma found an old cedar chest she had not opened since Mary's funeral. Inside lay neatly folded quilts, a pair of tiny baby shoes, several letters, and her mother's leather-bound journal. Emma carefully opened it. Most pages spoke about ordinary things. Harvests, children, the weather. Then one sentence caught her eye. She read it once. Then again, tears blurred the ink. If one day I am no longer beside Thomas, I pray you find someone who will love our children as completely as I have. Emma covered her mouth. Below that sentence, another line appeared in Mary's familiar handwriting. Our children deserve love, even after mine is gone. The journal slipped into Emma's lap. For the first time since her mother's death, she realized accepting another person's kindness did not mean losing the woman who had first taught her what love looked like. That evening, Emma quietly watched Clara through the kitchen doorway. Clara was helping Jacob practice his reading. Patient, gentle, never pretending to be anyone else. Never asking to be called mother. Simply choosing, day after day, to love a family that had never truly been hers. Emma wiped away another tear. Outside, the first heavy snowflakes of the season drifted across the ranch. Thomas looked toward the darkening sky from the porch. The coming storm would test every promise made beneath that roof. And before it passed, one life would hang by the thinnest thread of hope. The blizzard arrived before dawn with a wind so fierce it rattled every window in the Carter farmhouse. Snow swept across the pasture until the fences disappeared beneath a white curtain. Thomas had barely finished securing the barn doors when Jacob came racing inside, his face pale. "The little calf," he gasped. "She's still out there." Before anyone could stop him, the boy darted back into the storm. "Jacob!" Thomas shouted. The wind swallowed his voice. Within seconds, the child had vanished into the snow. Thomas grabbed his heavy coat and rifle, but Clara was already pulling a wool blanket over her shoulders. "I'm going. The storm's too strong. He'll be looking for the calf near the north pasture." Thomas reached for her arm. "I'll find him. We'll lose precious minutes if we argue." She looked him straight in the eye. "Your son needs us now." Without waiting for another word, Clara disappeared into the white darkness. Thomas followed close behind. The storm erased every track almost as quickly as they appeared. Thomas searched toward the creek. Clara headed for the old windbreak, where frightened calves often gathered. She called Jacob's name until her throat burned. Nothing. Then a weak cry drifted through the wind. "Miss Clara." She climbed over a snow-covered fallen tree and found Jacob curled beside the frightened calf, wrapping his own little coat around the trembling animal. His lips had turned blue. "I didn't want her to freeze." Clara dropped to her knees. "You've been very brave. But it's time to go home." Jacob tried to stand. His legs gave way. Clara lifted him into her arms despite the bitter cold. Step after exhausting step, she carried him toward the faint lantern light Thomas held in the distance. By the time they reached the house, Jacob was safe. Clara collapsed. For 3 days, fever refused to leave her. The doctor said little. Now we wait. Thomas hardly left her bedside. He changed cool cloths through the night. He whispered prayers he had not spoken aloud since Mary died. Emma quietly helped prepare broth. Jacob refused to sleep until he had asked the same question every evening. Is Miss Clara getting better? No one could promise him. On the 4th morning, Clara finally opened her eyes. Thomas had fallen asleep beside the bed with one hand still resting gently over hers. She smiled weakly. "You look terrible." He laughed through tears. "I've looked worse." "I don't believe that." He lowered his head. "I do." He paused for a long moment. "When Mary died, I thought loving anyone again meant leaving her behind." His voice nearly failed him. "I finally understand I was wrong." Clara listened silently. "I was never afraid of forgetting my wife." He looked into her tired eyes. "I was afraid of losing someone I loved again." The room became very still. "I nearly lost you." Before Clara could answer, the bedroom door opened softly. Emma stepped inside. She walked slowly across the room until she stood beside the bed. For several seconds, she simply looked at Clara. Then, with trembling arms, she leaned forward and wrapped her in the gentlest embrace. "Mom." The single word broke every wall that had remained between them. Clara covered her face as tears finally came. Emma cried with her. Jacob hurried across the room and threw his arms around them both. Thomas quietly turned toward the window, giving them the privacy of a father whose greatest prayer had just been answered. Spring returned to Montana, with green grass stretching across the hills. One afternoon, Thomas asked Clara to walk with him to the old cottonwood where Mary rested. Fresh wildflowers lay beside the headstone. Thomas removed his hat. "I came here for years believing no one could ever stand beside me again." He looked at Clara. "I don't want anyone to replace Mary. No one ever could." He reached gently for Clara's hands. "I only want the woman who helped my children smile again to stay beside us for the rest of our lives." Her eyes filled with tears. "Thomas, will you marry me?" She nodded before she found her voice. "Yes." The wedding took place outside the little church on a warm Sunday afternoon. Martha cried before the ceremony even began. Sheriff Daniel smiled wider than anyone had ever seen. The whole town gathered beneath clear Montana skies as Thomas and Clara promised not only to love one another, but to protect the family they had already built together. Years passed. The ranch grew stronger. So did the laughter inside it. Emma became a young teacher, inspiring children with the same kindness Clara had once shown her. Jacob grew into a hard-working rancher who never forgot the woman who had carried him through a blizzard. Visitors often noticed something unusual about the Carter home. No traveler was ever turned away hungry. There was always another bowl of soup, another chair by the fire, another blanket waiting by the door. One quiet evening, the family gathered on the front porch as the sun settled beyond the Montana hills. Clara rested her head against Thomas's shoulder. She smiled and whispered, "The day I told you I had no family left, I thought my life was over." Thomas gently squeezed her hand. "No." He smiled toward the children, and now grandchildren, playing in the yard. That was the day our family began. If this story reminded you that family is sometimes chosen through love instead of blood, share where you're watching from, and remember this. The warmest homes are often built by hearts brave enough to open the door one more time.